was January 10th in the year 1901 that a drilling derrick at Spindletop Hill near Beaumont, Texas, produces an enormous gusher of crude oil, coating the landscape for hundreds of feet and signaling the advent of the American oil industry. The geyser was discovered at a depth of over 1,000 feet, flowed at an initial rate of approximately 100,000 barrels a day, and took 9 days to cap. Following the discovery, petroleum, which until that time had been used in the U.S. primarily as a lubricant and in kerosene for lamps, would become the main fuel source for new inventions such as cars and airplanes. Coal-powered forms of transportation, including ships and trains, would also convert to liquid fuel. Crude oil, which became the world's first trillion-dollar industry, is a natural mix of hundreds of different hydrocarbon compounds trapped in underground rock. These hydrocarbons were formed millions of years ago when tiny aquatic plants and animals continued their eternities and settled on the bottoms of ancient waterways, creating a thick layer of organic material. Sediment later covered this material, putting heat and pressure on it and transforming it into the petroleum that comes out of the ground today. In the early 1890s, Texas businessman and amateur geologist Petillo Higgins became convinced there was a large pool of oil under a salt dome formation south of Beaumont. He and several partners established the Gladys City Oil, Gas, and Manufacturing Company and made several unsuccessful drilling attempts before Higgins left the company. In 1899, Higgins leased a tract of land at Spindletop to mining engineer Anthony Lucas. The Lucas Gusher blew on January 10th in 1901 and ushered in the liquid fuel age. Unfortunately for Higgins, he lost his ownership stake at that point. Beaumont became a black gold boomtown, its population tripling in 3 months. The town filled up with oil workers, investors, merchants, and con men, leading some people to dub it Swindletop. Within a year, there were more than 285 active wells at Spindletop, and an estimated 500 oil and land companies operating in the area, including some that are major players today. Humble, which is now Exxon, the Texas Company, which is now Texaco, and the Magnolia Petroleum Company, which is now Mobil. Spindletop experienced a second boom starting in the mid-1920s when more oil was discovered at deeper depths. In the 1950s, Spindletop was mined for sulfur. Today, only a few oil wells still operate in the area. It was January 10th in the year 1941 that our 32nd president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, introduced the lend-lease program to Congress. The plan was intended to help Britain beat back Hitler's advance while keeping America only indirectly involved in World War II. As Roosevelt addressed Congress, the Battle of Britain was in its full destructive swing, and Hitler seemed on the verge of invading Great Britain. The cash-strapped Brits desperately needed airplanes, tanks, and ships to fight Hitler's imminent invasion. For months, Britain's Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, had begged Roosevelt for help, but the president was committed to abiding by Americans' wishes to stay out of another bloody world war. The lend-lease program provided military aid to any country whose defense was vital to the security of our nation. The plan thus gave Roosevelt the power to lend arms to Britain with the understanding that after the war, America would be paid back in kind. Congress overwhelmingly accepted the plan, which only staunch isolationists opposed. Roosevelt's program enabled the U.S. military to prepare for the growing threat of Japan on its Pacific flank while helping Britain to contain Hitler across the Atlantic, as it permitted aid to Europe without committing American troops that might be needed in a Pacific war. Even though Roosevelt's plan did not require immediate repayment, the U.S. government commandeered what was left of Britain's gold reserves and overseas investments to help pay for the increased defense production. With the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, Japan forced the entry of our nation into the war. Roosevelt then recognized the strategic advantage of also supplying the Soviet Union with arms under the lend-lease in order to draw Hitler's resources away from Western Europe. This gave the U.S. a better chance at fighting a war on two fronts while planning for an invasion to liberate Europe. Roosevelt, mindful of the inherent conflict between American democracy and Soviet communism, counted on using U.S. military aid to the Soviet Union as a bargaining chip in post-war diplomatic relations. By the end of the war, the U.S. had given more than $50 billion in armaments and financial support to Britain, the USSR, and 37 other countries. The lend-lease program laid a foundation for the post-war Marshall Plan, which provided aid to European nations to help rebuild their economies after two devastating world wars. It was January 10th in the year 1946 that the first General Assembly of the United Nations, comprising 51 nations, convened at Westminster Central Hall in London, England. 1 week later, the UN Security Council met for the first time and established its rules of procedure. Then, on January 24th, the General Assembly adopted its first resolution, a measure calling for the peaceful uses of atomic energy and the elimination of atomic and other weapons of mass destruction. In 1944, at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in Washington, D.C., the groundwork was laid by Allied delegates for an international post-war organization to maintain peace and security in the post-war world. The organization's purpose, you can say, was to possess considerably more authority over its members than the defunct League of Nations, which had failed in its attempts to prevent the outbreak of World War II. In April of 1945, with celebrations of victory in Europe about to commence, delegates from 51 nations convened in San Francisco to draft the United Nations Charter. On June 26th, the document was signed by the delegates. By October 24th, it was formally ratified by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and a majority of other signatories. The historic information divulged on this audio file can be verified on History.com.